Welcome to our education research series. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, the Director of Community Solutions and Veterinary Behaviorist at Maddie's Fund. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. At Maddie's Fund, we believe strongly that maximizing animal welfare means keeping pets with their families when it's safe and humane to do so. Because of this, we're excited that our guest today is Lexis Lee, a PhD student in applied animal biology at the University of British Columbia's Animal Welfare Program. Her work uses animal shelter and community data to understand how to maintain human-animal bonds, help animal shelter services provide equitable services, and reduce intake to shelters. Today, Lexis will talk about the complex system of pet surrender and how community data can complement animal shelter data to help divert animals from shelters. Let's welcome Lexis to learn more.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here today, and it's so fun for me as a Canadian to see where everybody is coming from as well. Some cities that I'm familiar with and some that I'm not so much, but I'm learning a lot from my American friends. Today, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of research from a couple of different studies that I've done over the years, which largely aim to use community data to understand intake diversion of owner-surrendered animals. And just before I start my presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am presenting today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples, known colonially as Vancouver, Canada. I recognize that my data collection and my presentation today is being attended by and takes place across what we know colonially as Canada and the United States. So I just wanted to point out this website called native-land.ca, which shows a map of Indigenous lands and treaties and languages. And I just wanted to recognize that beyond our colonial borders, we do exist on a land that has this really rich history of Indigenous peoples who have a relationship to the land and to animals that requires continuous efforts of reconciliation. And this is something that might be particularly relevant to my own work, which was ultimately sparked by the One Welfare ideology. The formal use of this term in animal welfare is less than 10 years old, but we definitely can't ignore that this idea is grounded in unacknowledged Indigenous ways of knowing. Essentially, One Welfare states that human well-being, animal welfare, and environmental wellness are interconnected, and this concept has been used in multiple different ways in the space. So it's been used as a way to investigate animal shelter issues, a way to understand how animal and human well-being might impact one another, and also be impacted by the same physical and social spaces that they share. But One Welfare can also be used as an ideology to guide the creations of solutions. So it's hoped that One Welfare solutions should consider impacts on all three of these spheres and aim to create solutions to benefit all. And owner relinquishment provides an interesting case for One Welfare. So we know that for many animals, entering the shelter may not be the best option for their welfare. Many studies show that entering and staying in shelters increases stress in dogs and cats, and long stays can lead to deterioration of health and behavior. On the human side, relinquishing pet owners struggle with the decision to bring their pets to shelters. In interviews of relinquishing pet owners, researchers have found that pet owners are often quite heartbroken and, again, have a difficult time dealing with this decision to relinquish. And finally, animal shelters largely aim to reduce intake to remain at a reasonable capacity, as it's recognized that exceeding capacity in shelters has, again, detrimental impacts to the welfare of animals in shelter care, but also potentially negative impacts on organizational health, so health of the shelter staff and volunteers. And so with my research, I came in wanting to understand how can we align animal shelter services with community needs in order to reduce intake. And this is not something that is created by me. This is a goal that's shared by many who want to improve their own community-based programming of their shelters. Generally, there's this understanding that providing support for owned animals in our communities can help pet owners maintain that human-animal bond, thus reducing the need for animals to be relinquished. So then a question remained for me. How can we understand community needs? How can we understand more about who is entering shelters and what we can do to help these multi-species families remain intact? And so I recognize that currently what we know about owner relinquishment largely relies on the data that we collect at the time of intake. And so my journey began there with this question of animal shelter data. And in the research literature, this was first typically done through surveys that were administered at the intake room. But I'm sure, as many of you are familiar, animal shelter software now has been adapted to allow us to collect this level of data at animal shelters. And so we know that relinquishment reasons may vary across shelters, across time, but typically the way it's collected, animals may be relinquished for animal-related issues like behavior, but they also might be relinquished for owner-related issues like cost, housing, and personal issues. And the most common recommendation for the use of this data is to use owner relinquishment reasons as a way to understand community needs, so to inform our programming. However, I do recognize that there's concerns with the use of intake data to make these management decisions about programming. And for those of you who have input your data into shelter software, perhaps this is something that you've are also experienced. Some concerns that have been cited include this idea that while software might allow for maybe one or two categorical reasons to be inputted into software, it's recognized that the circumstances that lead to surrender are actually quite complex. As well, this data is only collected at the time of intake, so it's unclear how reflective this information is about the owner's circumstance. And so finally, with this push to collect better data, both within shelters and also in attempts to collect data on wider levels, like nationally, there is concerns about how consistent our animal shelter data really is, both at this level of individual shelters and also at these levels that allow us to compare data across shelter organizations. And so I recognize that no studies have actually empirically explored these concerns with animal shelter data. So I wanted to better understand how do shelter staff interpret owner circumstances when they are collecting data. And so in a study, we distributed an online experiment with staff working at a shelter or rescue in North America. Maybe some of you had seen this floating around on Maddie's forum, and thank you if anybody's here who actually took this survey. We provided shelter staff with 4 hypothetical scenarios about dog relinquishment, and then we asked them to input data based on choices that were adapted from our local shelter software. So I recognize that this might differ to maybe your own data collection practices, but from the software that we copied, this included options of 40 different surrender reasons, about 200 breeds, and 66 different colors. So the online experiment consisted of 4 different scenarios that outlined a conversation between a dog owner and a shelter staff, where an owner came to the shelter and provided reasons why they were surrendering their animal. In each scenario, the owner cited 2 human-related reasons and 2 animal-related reasons that they wanted to surrender the animal. And here we wanted to include both human and animal-related reasons because we wanted to understand whether there was any prioritization of entering human or animal-related reasons. And within this conversation, the shelter staff would also propose one intervention, either a spay-neuter or a behavioral consultation. The intervention was included to make the conversation sound a little bit more human, but this is also reflective of anecdotal experiences from shelter staff who might say that owners refuse services when asked at intake. And so the order and the type of intervention that was presented were balanced across scenarios. So the order of whether human or animal related reasons were shown first. As well, each scenario also included a photo of a dog, which was taken from one of my colleagues' studies, taking a look at photo background of online postings. And so we wanted to create a complex situation. And our goal here was not to see whether or not shelter staff could input what we intended, but rather whether the reasons that were selected across shelter staff were consistent or agreed upon in any way. So following each scenario, participants were asked to select the most influential or primary surrender reason. After this, in order to understand how many surrender reasons the shelter staff believed contributed to the surrender, we allowed staff to enter multiple reasons. And so they were asked if they believed there was an additional reason for surrender. And if they selected yes, then they were able to select an additional reason. If they selected no, they were brought to the next scenario. And so participants could select up to 10 reasons. And so after the questions about reason, we also asked about primary and secondary breed, as well as primary and secondary color of the dog. Our questions about breed and color were mostly just the secondary aim of our study, so they weren't necessarily as interesting to us as the reason, but it's recognized in the literature that there may be some difficulties with things like visual identification of breed, and so we wanted to include this as part of our survey again. And then once again, just to emphasize, these categories of surrender reasons were not created by me, but these were adapted. So again, I recognize that they might not reflect your own categories exactly, but we did want to create a more realistic situation that asked staff to choose from a predetermined list. And so we copied this from a shelter software that our local shelters here use. So this is an example of a scenario that we presented to shelter staff. And just to make things fun, and just because I can see the chat, I want to do a quick exercise that that's called waterfall. And so I'm going to read the scenario. And then what I want you to do is I want you to type in the chat what you believe the primary reason for relinquishment is. Just type it in your chat box, but don't send it just yet. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to count down. And then everybody can press enter at the same time. And the idea there is we will see a waterfall of responses come in. So first I can read the scenario for you all. So the owner says, "Hello, I'm here to surrender my dog." Shelter staff says, "Okay, could you tell us why you are giving him up?" And the owner says, "Well, for one, he is really hyper. Every time my girlfriend or I get home, he jumps all over us. Also, my girlfriend is pregnant, and I don't know if having a dog is best for our growing family." Staff says, "Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. If you would like, we have a dog training program where you can get some assistance." The owner says, "No, thank you. I think I want to give him up to you regardless. When I approach him while he's eating, he snarls and tries to stop at me, which is a problem. Taking care of him and the baby will just be too much. I won't be able to pay as much attention to him as I do now anyway." And the staff says, "I understand that." Okay, I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. Again, get your answers prepared in the chat. I think we're all perhaps ready for the waterfall now. So I'm going to count down from 3. And then when I get to 1, you can press enter, and then we can see what everybody thinks the primary reason for relinquishment is. 3, 2, 1, go. Great. Okay. So taking a look at some of the responses that are coming in, we see needs training or no time, the new baby, so this lifestyle change, doesn't want to take the time to train, behavior of the animal, as well as new baby, having a baby, behavior challenges, too much work, new baby. So I see here that there's quite a bit of a mix in terms of owner-related reasons, so maybe the lifestyle change of having a new baby, and also some behavioral concerns. Jumpy, possessive, too much work. Great. All right. And so I think that, like I said, we weren't necessarily looking here to see whether or not the shelter staff were right. We were looking for things like agreement. And so we can see here just from your responses to the waterfall that there was a number of reasons that could have been considered the primary reason based on how you might input your data to the shelter software. And so just for your curiosity, the reasons that we had written into this situation included behavior, that the dog was too active, a life change, so they were having a new baby, another behavioral issue category, so growling or lunging, and then this reason of no time for pet or the pet is too much responsibility. Okay. So taking a look at the results for this particular scenario, this table shows all of the reasons selected by participants in order of frequency. So there was a total of 81 participants. So for this first reason of life change, new baby, 60 out of the 81 participants had selected this as one of their possible reasons that contributed to surrender. It also shows the mean rank of the reasons. So mean ranks closer to 1 mean that the participants on average selected the reason as more influential as contributing to the relinquishment. And so looking at this already, we can see that there is a lot of variation of reasons selected by the individuals. So there were a total of 14 unique reasons that were selected. And so of the 4 reasons, the most frequently selected was new baby, and it also had the highest mean rank out of the 4. However, you can see here that not everyone selected the same number of reasons or ranked them the same. And so while 60 out of 81 participants selected new baby, only 35 had selected that the growling was contributing to the surrender. So we also took a look at the category of reasons. So in other words, grouping all of the selected reasons into either human or animal related reasons. So again, here, I was curious whether there was any trends for selection of human versus animal related reasons. And in this particular scenario, we found that animal reasons were selected more frequently than human related reasons, but here human related reasons had a higher rank on average. And just to drive the point home, as researchers, we're often only collecting and analyzing this primary reason for surrender. So here we looked more closely just at the primary reason or the most influential reason selected for each of the scenarios. And so here we see that there is also a low agreement for what the primary reason was. So much like we saw in the chat, most but not a majority of the participants had selected new babies. So that was selected by 36 out of 81 of the participants. And then here as well, we split this into human and animal categories, or I guess grouped it into human and animal related categories. And here we see that 63% of the participants selected a human related reason as the primary reason. So overall, very little consistency across what people believed was the primary reason that contributed to relinquishment. So taking a look at some of the results from across all 4 scenarios, similar results were seen, and we recognize that the results are probably subject to differ based on how the scenarios were written. Consistency in the primary reason and across all reasons selected by participants did differ, just naturally, just because some of the surrender narratives might have been more or less complex than others. However, generally, we found that across all 4 of these scenarios, the shelter staff did not select the same reasons or the same primary reasons largely. Something that's interesting to note is that across all 4 scenarios, the reason no time for pet/pet is too much responsibility came up within the top 5 most frequently selected reasons. And so this made me think about these reasons that might kind of often be cited by animal owners, but might have these very broad meanings when it comes to kind of operational decisions. So in all of these scenarios, the owner was experiencing some type of hardship that was taking away from their ability to care for the pet, which is why I think that this scenario came up, or this reason came up across all the scenarios. In the scenario that I showed you, it was written in as like a reason that was said, but it wasn't explicitly said in the other 3 scenarios. However, it did come up as the 5th most common reason that was selected. And so this might indicate that these reasons kind of generally capture the experience of relinquishing or the circumstances that lead to relinquishment. But it does kind of indicate to me that maybe we can consider what benefits some of these reasons bring to us in terms of information and management decisions. We also found that in 3 out of the 4 scenarios, the most commonly selected primary reason was owner-related. So maybe this indicates that these reasons jump out to staff as being more important to collect for any particular reason. And then finally, just a quick note on breed and color. We also found that they varied quite a bit. So for the primary and secondary breed of each color, there was a range of 22 to 32 different breeds that were selected across the scenarios. And again, we just wanted to take a look at this as we know that previous research suggests that the visual identification of breeds might be inaccurate to the dog's true breed. And I recognize that in a regular situation at the intake room, you'd probably be able to ask the owner. But here we did see that there was a range of breeds selected for the same dog. And as well, the primary and secondary breed were largely not agreed upon. Similarly, with color, participants selected anywhere between 4 and 25 different colors across the 4 scenarios. So the 4 colors were selected in a scenario where the dog was mainly black and white, whereas the highest number of colors were selected for a dog that was tan. Just to dig a little bit deeper and perhaps to explain some of our quantitative results, we wanted to know how people chose their primary reason. And so we asked them directly, when faced with complex reasons to surrender an animal, how do you choose what the primary reason for surrender is? And we analyzed this through qualitative thematic analysis, and percentages shown here show the frequency of this code across all respondents. And so these responses could contain more than one theme. And so here I'm just showing a few of the quote codes. So the most common way that respondents cited was simply just choosing the most influential reason. And oftentimes this answer was quite vague and would include words like the main reason or the best reason. We also found that around a quarter of respondents said that they ask the owner. So ask the owner directly and just write what they say. So for example, one person had said that they write down what is legally written as the reason for surrender. It is in their own handwriting and cannot be disputed based on their words. On the other hand, 19% of respondents said that they choose the underlying issue, that being the true issue, perhaps something that might go beyond what the owner originally states. So for example, this individual says, it is almost never the first thing the owner says, but in talking to them more or letting them talk, they do reveal the reason within what they say. There were a total of 7 different themes that were brought up in this question. Many participants cited lots of different ways that they select the primary reason, including the reason that they believed would influence future adoptions or provide the most information for future adopters, the issue with no solution, so the issue that still remains once all of these resources are offered to a pet owner. And then some also said that they could choose multiple reasons in their software, so they don't necessarily have to select a primary reason. We also recognize that our scenarios might not fully reflect staff experiences at intake, and so we asked staff what typical scenarios they faced during relinquishment. So this was just space to tell us how the scenarios in the survey were different or similar to their own experiences. These were not the most common responses, but these did stand out to me as themes that could also impact animal shelter data input. So for example, we see here that some individuals said that they deal with a number of stressful emotions. So this respondent said, not only is it hard for the owner, but intake coordinators have to field hostility, distress, and sad emotions that can be directed towards the animal facility situation and/or the intake coordinator themselves. Finally, another interesting theme that I'd like to mention was this idea of honesty. So in one quote, one shelter staff says, people are very vague/dishonest on the reason they surrender or not even acknowledge that the animal is theirs. They say they found the animal. So some respondents felt that owners withheld the truth to protect themselves or due to concerns for the animal's outcome. And previous research from Dr. Segerson did compare owner responses for a behavioral questionnaire where one group was told that their responses would be kept confidential. And they did find differences. Dr. Segerson, you'll have to remind me if this is incorrect, but there were differences in scores for owner-directed aggression and stranger-directed fear between the confidential and the non-confidential information groups. So perhaps there is this lack of trust between community members and shelter services that might be impacting the reliability of the data we collect at intake. And so from this study, perhaps future endeavors, maybe in your own shelter, maybe in larger conversations, could consider consolidation of data categories that might improve collection practices, and maybe even considering how these reasons actually influence our understanding of community needs and the programs and the management decisions we might be making as a result of this. We might consider a common method of selecting reasons, again, either within your own shelter or kind of more broadly. Maybe things like creating operational definitions might help with this. And then in addition, future research could consider how improvement of our relationship with community members might impact the consistency of the data that we collect. So with intake data, overall, our research suggests that we can understand some of the circumstance that contributes to owner relinquishment, but this information is subjective and might be limited by inconsistent data collection practices. And so in my own journey, this led me to think, if our goal is to ultimately reduce intake due to owner relinquishment, what more can we learn about relinquishment to help us understand these circumstances that lead people to come to shelters? So I wanted to know whether we could look beyond animal shelter data to learn a little bit more about the process of relinquishing an animal. And so in my second study, I wanted to understand a little bit more about the communities that were engaging with owner relinquishment. So in another study, I aimed to understand how community conditions were related to owner relinquishment to shelters. So we used data from the BCSPCA shelters, so that's here in British Columbia. That's a network of 34 shelters across the province. And we connected this data to community level data in Canada. And we compared community level vulnerability to the species of the animal that was relinquished, the health status, which was determined by Asilomar Accords, the spay-neuter status of the animal at intake, and as well relinquishment reasons as reported by staff. And I know this is a little bit contradictory of me as I just spent the last 20 minutes telling you about the potential unreliability of intake data. So perhaps as a caveat, as we just discussed, these reported reasons might not be fully reflective of the circumstances of the pet owner, but rather interpretation of the staff in terms of something that contributed to relinquishment at the time of intake. And so today we're just going to be going over a few of these results. So to measure community level vulnerability, we used the Canadian Index of Multiple Deprivations, or the CIMD. So this is similar to the Social Vulnerability Index in the US, if anybody's familiar. This is derived from census data, and it uses units of area called dissemination areas. So each dissemination area is made up of about 400 to 700 people, and it's the smallest unit for which all census data is collected in Canada. The CIMD was created using a factor analysis to create 4 indicators of vulnerability for each province in Canada. And so these aggregate factors that I'm showing you here are specific to BC's most prevalent vulnerabilities. So the first factor that we're going to talk about today is ethnocultural composition. So this is the amount of self-identified visible minorities, immigrants, and linguistically isolated people in an area. And then situationally vulnerable communities, this might be what we more typically think of when we look at socioeconomic status. So this includes the proportion of low-income population, the proportion of people with fewer years of education, the proportion of single-parent families, dwellings needing major repairs, and also those who identify as Indigenous. And so this factor is made up of some individual kind of variations as well. So one example of a result that we found is that we found that communities with increased ethnocultural composition predicted increased risk of relinquishing for all owner-related reasons in comparison to the most common reason of having too many animals. So what these points say is that areas with increased proportions of racialized populations were at greater risk of surrendering for personal issues, housing issues, guardian health issues, and being unable to afford the animal. And so this may indicate that minority and immigrant status might be related to increased owner-related risks. And there is previous research in Canada that does suggest that these risks might be true. So for example, Canadians that identify as an ethnic minority are at a higher risk of various poor physical and mental health outcomes. And also often immigrants to Canada report difficulties finding housing. And so all of these examples possibly put racialized populations at a higher risk of surrendering for these owner-related reasons. We also found that situational vulnerability predicted increased risk of surrender for puppies, kittens, and intact animals. And so situational vulnerability is a bit difficult to tease apart because, again, it is made up of a lot of these kind of individual variations in sociodemographic conditions. But here, our results are congruent with some previous literature that identifies a relationship between low-income communities and relinquishment of unwanted litters of puppies and kittens. And so taking a look again at community level data, overall, the results from these studies tell us that community level data could help us understand a little bit more about who might be relinquishing animals, and also might indicate locations and populations that we can support. So for example, in BC here, perhaps reaching out to communities with higher proportions of racialized populations with perhaps more culturally competent owner support might improve the effectiveness of the diversion strategies that we're trying to employ. However, I think there's still a little bit more to learn about the actual decisions that lead to relinquishment. And so again, I thought, can we look beyond animal shelter data to learn a little bit more about relinquishment? Again, with this idea that one potential issue with looking at animal shelter data is that we're really only seeing a small subsection of the people and animals that are relinquishing their animals, or that are relinquishing. And so our understanding of community needs is really informed by the information that's captured about a small proportion of people who choose to bring their animals to a shelter. And so by focusing on shelter data, we might be missing some of this information about what community members might benefit from in terms of support. And so I decided to look at self-rehoming. So this is just any practice where animals are placed in new homes without intake to a shelter. So this could be through friends or family or perhaps online. And there are previous studies at intake that have suggested that people sometimes try other rehoming options before bringing their animals into shelters. But largely self-rehoming remains pretty understudied as a form of diversion from shelters. And so for my next study, I wanted to understand what happens to animals after they're posted on a self-rehoming website. So we looked at data from Adopt a Pet's rehome program from 2017 to 2021, and this data is just from the US. The clean data included over 100,000 dogs and over 48,000 cats. And so we are interested in understanding the outcomes of the animals posted on rehome. So we looked at and grouped the final outcomes of pet profiles. So these could either be set by rehome or set by the owner to indicate what happened to the animal. So after being posted on rehome, an animal could be retained by their original owner either for a set period or indefinitely, which we grouped into a category called kept. The animal could be adopted through the website, so through rehome. It could be adopted to family or friends or to others, which we grouped into the adopted category. And then finally, the animal could be surrendered to a shelter or a rescue, which we grouped into the relinquished category. So for the purposes of our study, we considered the animal being kept or being adopted as being diverted because in both cases, the animal doesn't enter the shelter. And so our first interest was to understand what factors predicted increased odds of diversion through rehome, so which animals were kept or adopted versus those that were relinquished to the shelter. But then we also realized that a secondary interest would be among the animals that were being diverted from shelters, which factors increased odds of the animal being adopted versus being kept by their original owner. So taking a look at some of our results overall for dogs, we found that 87% of the animals posted on rehome were either adopted or kept, and then the remaining 13% were relinquished to shelters. Just before we get started with the results, I'll say that this is just a visual representation of the results, but it isn't actually to scale in terms of the degrees of these relationships. So we took a look at a number of the morphological characteristics, and we found that some of these did predict increased odds of diversion. So as age increased, diversion decreased, meaning that older dogs were at the greatest risk of being relinquished to shelters. We found that in comparison to small dogs, medium and large sized dogs had higher odds of being relinquished. And then we also found that in comparison to mixed breed dogs, purebred dogs had increased odds of being diverted through the platform. So on the other hand, that means that mixed breed dogs might have been more likely to be relinquished. We also took a look at a number of behavioral characteristics. We found that dogs that were good with cats, good with other dogs, and good with children had increased odds of being diverted in comparison to dogs that were not marked as those traits. We also found that dogs that needed an experienced adopter and those that had special needs had decreased odds of being diverted. So again, in other words, they had a greater risk of being relinquished. We also found that for rehome reason, all of the owner-related rehome reasons, except for cost-related issues, increased odds of a dog being diverted in comparison to behavioral issues. So taking a look at these results, they are very similar to our understanding of preferences of adopters from shelters. So it seems that animals that are likely to be diverted from the platform are those that are younger, smaller, purebred, perhaps less potential for behavioral incompatibility with their new owners. Interestingly, the platform also asked about how long the owner had to rehome their animal, and we found that in comparison to those who said that they had less than 1 week to rehome their animal, so a short deadline, those with longer deadlines of 2 to 4 weeks, over 8 weeks, or no deadline had increased odds of diverting their animal. So this might indicate that those who are experiencing crisis or perhaps don't have the time to be able to engage in the rehoming process are also those that are at risk of entering shelters. Taking a look at cats, we found some similarities and differences between diverted dogs and cats. So similar to dogs, as age increased for cats, odds of diversion decreased. And so that older cats were at risk of entering shelters. As well, purebred cats had greater odds of being diverted in comparison to mixed breed cats. In terms of behavioral characteristics, there were some differences. So cats that were good with dogs and good with children had increased odds of diversion, but there was no statistically significant relationship between cats that were good with other cats. And then we also found no difference for cats who were marked as needing an experienced adopter or marked as having special needs. And then unlike dogs, there was also no difference for the rehome reasons. But taking a look at owners' flexibility here, as rehome deadline increased, the odds of diversion also increased as well. So for both dogs and cats, morphological characteristics were important in predicting outcome, as well as flexibility of the owner was important. So as rehome deadline increased, more animals were able to be diverted. But here for cats, less of the behavioral characteristics were important for predicting odds of diversion for cats in comparison to dogs. So moving on to our second aim, again, here we were interested in what happens in the process of diversion. So of the animals posted on rehome, we did find that 32% of them were kept, while 55% of them were adopted. So here I've combined dogs and cats for just a more general summary of our results. So here we found that those same characteristics that predicted increased odds of diversion were predictive of adoption rather than keeping the animal. So again, that indicates to me that success of adoption on this particular platform has to do with kind of adopter preference. So animals that are generally desirable are more likely to be adopted to a new home. But then that might mean that the owners whose animals are not rehomed are left with this decision to keep their animal or to relinquish their animal to a shelter. On the other hand, as rehome deadline increased, the odds of an animal being kept increased, so those with longer deadlines were more likely to keep their pets. So this might indicate that the circumstances that led to rehoming, again, maybe weren't urgent or could be resolved in some way. So perhaps longer deadlines allow pet owners to access more support. So time was quite important in this case. So our results from the self-rehoming website tell us that animals are being rehomed in our communities. However, these results suggest that vulnerable people, so those who might not have the time to engage with the rehoming process, and vulnerable pets, so those that are older, maybe have behavioral concerns, are still at risk of entering shelters. But still here, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the circumstances that led to relinquishment through self-rehoming or to shelters. So once again, I wanted to explore here now pet owners' perspectives for individuals who had self-rehomed or relinquished their animals to the shelter, including the pathways that had led them there and their experiences with rehoming. And so I asked what characteristics are related to these various rehoming methods. I surveyed Canadian and US public members, and we asked for pet owners who had rehomed an animal within the past 5 years about their circumstance and the animal that they were rehoming. We asked them again about their reasons for rehoming, their worries when they were rehoming an animal. And here I wanted to ask more directly whether they had received any assistance or sought any assistance that would help them keep their pets. So at first, we were interested in primarily understanding the outcomes of self-rehoming and relinquishing pet owners, but then we actually recognized that our data was set up in such a way that they could select all of the actions that they took when they were rehoming their animal. And so our survey actually revealed 4 potential populations of individuals who are rehoming their animal. So first, we found that about 13% of the sample had relinquished their animal to a shelter without trying any other self-rehoming methods beforehand. So relinquishment was their first and only option. We found that 20% of the sample had tried to contact the shelter, either by bringing the animal to the shelter or connecting by calling. However, their final method ended up being a self-rehoming method. 60% of the population that we had sampled had successfully self-rehomed their animal without ever contacting the shelter. And then 8% had tried some sort of self-rehoming method, but their animal was ultimately relinquished to the shelter. So here, while our interest initially was understanding how self-rehoming and relinquishing circumstances differ, we recognized that we could potentially take a look at some of these unique populations who took various pathways to rehome, either with or without the shelter's help. This data is still being analyzed, and so these results are a little bit messy and a little bit incomplete, but today I am excited to share a little bit of our descriptive analysis from some of these explorations. So first, taking a look at pet source, we saw that the majority of animals who were relinquished to the shelter without any previous self-rehoming methods, so this red bar, were largely obtained from the shelter. So this potentially indicates this sample was largely returned animals, or at least people who were familiar with the sheltering system. On the other hand, notably for the purple bar, those who had tried to self-rehome and then relinquish their animal to a shelter were largely from non-shelter sources. Taking a look at the length of ownership, I was curious here, again, whether or not this relinquished population might indicate returns. And here we do see on this farthest left bar that a higher proportion of animals in the relinquished group had rehomed their animal within less than a year of owning it. So again, this could indicate that a large proportion of this population is returned animals, while on the other hand, people who had self-rehomed their animals without any sort of contact with shelter had a smaller proportion of people who had rehomed their animal after owning it for less than a year. These are some of those same animal characteristics that we talked about when we were talking about self-rehoming platforms. And so interestingly, looking at those animal characteristics, there were some characteristics that were similar across those whose final outcome was relinquished. So those who either relinquished as their first option or as their final option after self-rehoming. And namely here, a higher proportion of the relinquishing pet owners needed an experienced adopter. So that's taking a look at this red bar and this purple bar. A much higher proportion of purebred animals were self-rehomed without contacting the shelter at all. So taking a look at this really tall blue bar. And then you can see here as well that a higher proportion of relinquishing pet owners also had neutered animals and then also had animals that had either special behavioral or medical needs. So again, these results actually might be similar to our previous study, which again found that after being posted on a rehome website, those that were purebred had increased odds of diversion, whereas those who reported behavioral difficulties or special needs were at risk of being relinquished to the shelter still. Taking a look at rehome reason, we asked participants to select all the reasons that contributed to the rehoming of their pets. And so what you're seeing here is the proportion within each of these groups of individuals who had said that this particular reason contributed to the rehoming of their animal. And you can see here again with these red and purple bars that those who relinquished to a shelter as their first or final option were more likely to select behavior as a contribution to rehoming. Interestingly, while those who relinquished their animals were not as commonly selecting owner-related reasons for relinquishment, those who tried to self-rehome before relinquishing did select owner-related reasons in a similar frequency to the groups who had self-rehomed their animals through either method. This is a lot, and I'll zoom in a sec, but we also asked pet owners about a number of different worries related to rehoming their pet. So on the right side, it shows the proportion of individuals who agreed or strongly agreed, and then on the purple side on the left, it shows the proportion of the population who disagreed or strongly disagreed. So in response to the worry that people might find out I rehomed my pet and judged me, both groups who relinquished their animals and also those who tried self-rehoming and eventually relinquished their animals had a higher proportion of respondents agree with this statement. We also found that some worries were more strongly agreed with by participants who had tried more than one rehoming method. So those that either self-rehomed and then relinquished, or those who tried to relinquish and then self-rehomed. Namely, they were more worried that rehoming might take too long, which again might make sense considering that they had tried multiple options. And then while less strong, they also agreed slightly more with the worry that the perfect match for their pet might not be found. So there may be some concerns here in terms of the process of rehoming through these multiple means. Interestingly, some worries were more strongly agreed with by participants who had self-rehomed before relinquishing their pet. So they agreed more strongly that the location of rehoming might not be convenient, that they might not be able to select the adopter of their pet, that their pet might be euthanized. Notably, this worry was more strongly agreed with by the other groups who had also connected with the shelter, including those who tried to bring their animal to a shelter but then ended up self-rehoming their animal, and then as well those who relinquished as their first and only option. And then this self-rehoming to relinquishment group was also more worried that they might not be able to keep contact with their pet. So here the results might indicate that those who have tried self-rehoming methods and then relinquish might experience particular difficulties with this decision to relinquish their animal, potentially due to unfamiliarity with the sheltering system more broadly. We also asked individuals whether they sought assistance to keep their pets. In hindsight, I think this question was asked in a way that was potentially a little bit unclear. And so we asked people if they had sought assistance kind of broadly to help keep their pets. And so we didn't specify necessarily what seeking assistance meant. So it could be anything from they actually attended training lessons to help them improve their situation, or maybe it was that they searched around online to look for like a groomer in their area or something like that. And so this could have ranged quite a bit. We did find here that those who tried self-rehoming and then relinquished their animals, so at the bottom, had the highest proportion of participants say that they had tried to seek assistance. And participants who relinquished their animal to the shelter had the second highest proportion. We also asked directly what assistance they would have sought or they did seek. And the most commonly mentioned supports included behavioral support. So this included seeking trainers, trying at-home methods, or asking personal networks like friends or family for advice. This also included part-time care. So people talked about asking personal networks for help or short-term care, doggy daycare perhaps, or walking services. And finally, people commonly mentioned veterinary support. So seeking veterinary support for health and behavior, maybe seeking out medication or care for an animal's health issue. This data is combined across all groups for now. Again, analysis in progress, but we did ask individuals to describe why they did not seek assistance to help keep their pets. By far, the most common reason was that people felt that it couldn't be helped or that the assistant didn't help. So this person said, we didn't think any form of assistance would be helpful. Another said, I tried everything and nothing worked. People also cited accessibility issues, so cost, like this individual is saying here, where they said, I did not think I could afford a trainer. I was lost on what to do. Whereas other forms of accessibility issues might have been things like distance or maybe lack of knowledge. And then people also cited welfare of the pet as being a reason to not seek assistance. So basically that concerns for their welfare meant that they felt that the pet would be better to be rehomed rather than to stay with them. Convenience of rehoming was also cited amongst those who had self-rehomed and also relinquished their animals. So the idea that rehoming was more convenient than seeking assistance to help keep their pets. So this individual said, we had friends who really loved her and we knew she would have a great life with them. Whereas this individual said the shelter had a return policy, so I was not prepared to raise a cat so young, and I knew she wouldn't have trouble getting adopted again. Like I said, this analysis has been in progress, but surveying pet owners did reveal to us that animals who entered shelters were more likely to have special needs or need experienced adopters, as well as cite behavioral concerns as part of their reason for surrender. Both of these groups were also quite concerned about judgment, and people who did relinquish often did try to seek assistance, but again, a bit unclear what that meant to pet owners. Our results also show that those who tried to self-rehome before relinquishing to a shelter were particularly concerned about shelter relinquishment. So perhaps this study might capture this kind of last resort population who are relinquishing their animals after they were unable to successfully adopt out their animals and then also unable to successfully keep their animals. So overall, this study reveals a little bit more about the populations that might relinquish to shelters. This study is congruent with our previous results that indicate that the ability to self-rehome an animal is likely related to the animal's adoptability. However, I would say that this is a convenient sample, so there might be a little bit more bias for those responding to the survey in favor of circumstances that they believed were more justifiable. So maybe perhaps due to behavioral problems with their pets. As well, the population of pets that were relinquished and then self-rehomed, so they contacted the shelter, but then ultimately ended up self-rehoming, did show that they were more similar to the self-rehomed population. But here, it's not very clear how the process of diversion from the shelter actually occurred. So perhaps the next course of action research-wise could be to capture the experiences of pet owners at first contact with the shelter. And maybe this is something that everybody here has experience with and maybe has suggestions for next steps there. So overall, my studies have shined a bit more light on what we know about owner relinquishment. We learned that data collected at intake might not be completely reflective of owner circumstances, and so there are further efforts and discussions here that are needed to understand how these data translates to our understanding of community needs. Understanding community vulnerability could help us target pet support services. So our study was done at the BCSPCA, but there's lots of other research out there that does something similar. And there's also recommendations from like Humane Society of the United States Pets for Life outreach toolkit, I think that can that makes recommendations about how to implement this in your own community. Self-rehoming websites can help divert animals, but owners in crises and unsuccessfully rehomed animals might still be relinquished. As well, those who relinquished as their first and only option might represent kind of the return population in our survey who had familiarity with the shelter system and, of course, obtained their animal from the shelter. But in the population of people who had tried self-rehoming and then relinquished, this population was similar to the other relinquishing group in terms of animal level characteristics, but this group also reported owner-related reasons in a similar proportion to our self-rehomed groups, and also had the highest proportion of individuals who reported seeking some sort of assistance. So this group might largely represent a group of individuals who are accessing shelters as a safety net rather than due to familiarity with the shelter system, particularly given that this population was likely to source animals from places other than shelters. And then finally, community needs described by pet owners in our study suggested that things like behavioral support, part-time care, and veterinary services were important. And we know that animal shelters are less likely to, or some of these services might be difficult for animal shelters to offer for their community members. As well, these services in our survey were more commonly sought through other kind of non-shelter methods, so through trainers or through veterinarians. And so this supports the idea that there is a strong network of pet support that's needed to address community needs. And again, maybe perhaps suggests that these services might be less impactful when suggested upon intake. That's all for me. I know that was a huge data dump, so I'm really excited to hear your questions and thoughts. Please feel free to connect with me through any of these means if you'd like to chat further after.
Thank you so much, Lexis. This was super interesting. So we do have a couple of questions. The first question is actually based on that first scenario that you shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how would you determine that a dog is hyper? Just because he jumps up? Not time for training or desire to train is what I see, but I would not say the dog is hyper just with these comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's something that's perhaps reflective of just how we had set up our survey in the sense that we set it up in the format of a conversation that was typed out. And so perhaps in a at the intake room, you would also be able to make some of your judgment based on the behavior of the animal that you see. And perhaps maybe that's kind of indicative that we should be taking information from lots of these different sources. So from things like behavioral evaluations and also from things like owners' reports of their behavior. Yeah, I think that it definitely depends as well in terms of how your software is set up and how your organization chooses to, or you as an individual choose to input this data. So again, like I said, lots of these kind of concerns could be due to not having time, but I think that that's more of a question of whether or not inputting data like no time is something that helps inform us in terms of our management practices. I'm not sure if I fully answered that question, but I'm hoping that yeah, this is something that is a little bit complex.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. And this, I feel like for me, one of the things I think about this topic a lot, but one of the things that I got from this presentation is just how complicated just the process of selecting intake reason is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think so. And I think that it was pretty clear even from our own kind of waterfall exercise that it is really difficult.
Yeah. So next question related to the same topic. Do you recommend that shelters be able to record multiple surrender reasons? If so, should they be ranked by priority? Should there be a limit on number of reasons?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is a direct recommendation that I can make, and I think that this is something that, again, kind of requires a larger discussion about like the purpose of collecting these reasons and their effectiveness in being able to inform management decisions. I would say broadly, from my results, we did find that most people tended to input a median of around 2 reasons for relinquishment. So but of course, that's limited by the fact that in our survey, we had given people situations where there was 4 reasons listed. And so there was a range in terms of some people put like 1, some people put up to 6 at some points. And so I think that I I would say that as a recommendation, shelters would probably benefit from being able to record multiple surrender reasons, if only to capture a little bit more information. And then in terms of ranking by priority, I think that this is something that needs a little bit more research, but I think that perhaps my initial concern and something that still stands is that ranking by priority does often lead to just analysis of this kind of primary reason as being the indicator of community needs. And then in terms of a limit on the number of reasons, I think that that's pretty reasonable from an organizational data management perspective. And I think that that's something that I can't necessarily make a reflection on or a recommendation on, but could be researched in terms of how many reasons people might disclose in kind of these conversations. There was quite an old study that had taken a look at this. So some of they had surveyed people and asked people to qualitatively just describe why they're surrendering their animal. And they found that, again, it was kind of around two reasons that people had said, or two kind of categories of reasons or groups of reasons that they had said when they had analyzed their data. So maybe that's the first way to start, is allowing for more than one.
Thank you. Next question is, we have found that with cats, people are often shamed on social media platforms for rehoming their animals using programs like Home to Home or social media. People get pressured to surrender their cats to shelters instead. Have you found that cultural pressure or misconceptions in social media communities can increase the number of people surrendering to shelters versus finding new homes for their animals? Does this pertain more to cats versus dogs? And just a comment on those keyboard warriors, and that it can be really bad.
This is such an interesting question to me because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So we found in our most recent survey that people who had engaged with the shelter as their final rehoming method also did have kind of more positive attitudes towards the shelter. And again, because this was a cross-sectional survey asking people about their previous experiences with relinquishment, this could be like kind of a way to justify the relinquishment decision that can be really difficult. But it could also indicate that, like, as we improve our community relations with people, people might trust us more to be able to kind of take in their animals and provide good care. And so that is a bit of a catch-22 when we're trying to support people in a way that they can keep their animals. And so I see this all the time online as well, where under every single kind of self-rehoming post that you see online, people will say, you should bring it to your local shelter. And mainly the reason is because people might believe that they will do a better job of helping to adopt out their animal. So again, maybe this is something to think about research-wise or just within our organizations about communications of our programming and emphasis on things like intake diversion, if that's something that your organization practices. And then kind of, yeah, also making sure that people feel empowered and motivated to have that support to be able to keep their animals as a first option, perhaps. And then in terms of cats versus dogs, I actually don't know. And I think that that is something that would be really interesting to research, because we know that their ability to be self-rehomed and their might be a bit different. And so that would definitely impact in terms of yeah, how they may be perceived when people are trying to self-rehome their animal. So many interesting questions that deserve more research.
Yes. Next question is around the topic of the perception of people lying on their intake form or their intake reasons. And sometimes they might really be lying. Sometimes we're just suspicious they are. But what are your thoughts based on your experience and research on things that shelters can do to increase the likelihood that people will be open and honest with them?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely recommendations around this that exist. And so perhaps the simplest one is just having like a separate room as your kind of intake room or where you're collecting the data. That might make people feel more comfortable. But beyond that, I think that, again, this might come back to messaging. And so it is because we know that this is such a difficult decision. I think that kind of removing some of the stigma around relinquishment might help with improving community relations. But then this makes me think as well, if we kind of reduce some of that stigma, it's not necessarily that we want to encourage people to relinquish. We do want to encourage people to be able to keep their pets. So again, a little bit complex in terms of how this might play out. But yeah, I think that there is a little bit more knowledge that needs to be created in terms of how we actually reduce stigma kind of at the intake level and also kind of at the communications level with our community. Again, not a super direct answer, but
Thank you, Lexis. I really appreciate that. This presentation has been so very interesting, and I thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I also want to thank all of you here with us today watching the webcast. Lexis will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to answer the questions that we didn't have time to get to today, as well as to continue this discussion. Feel free to post more questions there. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
thanks everyone.